Welcome to Patriotic Pulpit. I am Bill Lockwood. Just the other day, we passed Columbus Day. Americans honored Columbus, the founding of America, greatest country that has ever existed. Kamala Harris, however, doubled down, according to the New York Post, on renaming Columbus Day after past comments resurface. She made some comments that show basically her ignorance about Columbus Day. Not only so, but it shows that she has just bought into the liberal lie about what Columbus was all about Americans, European settlers coming here. So here's the article, and then I'm going to make some comments regarding it. I think this is one of the most misunderstood issues that we face. That is regarding the American Indians and white settlement and all those things that occurred, because it's always nostalgic for people to go back and say, you know what, I hate that we can't live in the wild like they used to be and so forth. But you know what? There is a lot of misunderstanding on this one, and we want to talk about some of that for a few moments. So this was just the other day, Vice President Kamala Harris reiterated her support for renaming Columbus Day, and her past comments resurfaced. And so the Trump campaign and others accused her of trying to cancel American traditions. She wrote, "The Indigenous Peoples Day," she wrote on X, "I am thinking about the young indigenous leaders I met in Arizona last week. I'm counting on their leadership, and I look forward to their partnership." During the Democratic nominee's failed 2020 presidential campaign and vice presidential tenure, she repeatedly said in public remarks that she was supportive of labeling the federal holiday Indigenous Peoples Day. "Count me in," Harris told a voter who asked during a February 2019 campaign stop in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, whether she would change the name of the day via federal law. She said, "I am going to change the name of the day." Let me just stop here and point out this whole categorizing people, Indigenous People Day, and I'm indigenous to this country. You know what? All of the Indians that came here just because they got here before my ancestors got here from Europe. Doesn't mean that I'm not indigenous to this country. It just is absolutely an atrocity to take the term and change it and twist it up. People, she said, people do not want to deal and accept, and more importantly, admit that we are the scene of a crime when it comes to what we did with slavery and Jim Crow and institutionalized racism in this country, and we have to be honest about that, Harris said at the same time. All right, let's just unpack that for a moment. She says that this America is a crime scene. I want to stop and ask, honestly, the American people, is this the kind of person that we want running our country? Is this the kind of person that we want to be the leader of our country, that we are saying America is a crime scene? She doesn't know history. She doesn't know reality. She doesn't know any of this. It's just political nonsense, Marxist nonsense to destroy the heritage of America. Let's just say something regarding slavery real quickly. Slavery, indeed, occurred in America. No one denies that. But our founding fathers, all of them objected to slavery. Thomas Jefferson, even when he got to the House of Burgesses, the first bill that he submitted in the House of Burgesses, while Virginia was still a colony, was to eliminate slavery. Yes, he was a slaveholder, but he knew that it was wrong, and he wanted to eliminate slavery. Do you know who disallowed it? England. They disallowed it because it was an English colony. They disallowed Americans to get rid of slavery, and so it became ingrained in America. And then after that, the cotton gin was invented, and things began to change. But at first, in America, they wanted to get rid of slavery. They recognized its wrongness. Not only that, but they put right into the Constitution that slavery, the importation of slaves, would end within 20 years. America has not invented slavery. America got rid of slavery, one of the only countries in the world to do so. You might even think this way, note this, that right now, why would Kamala Harris be so excited about condemning history of America by saying we had slaves, when in point of fact, the Quran, the Muslim holy book, teaches slavery, and slavery is practiced in all those countries of the world where Islam is dominant right now. I challenge anyone to tell me how that's not the case. Islam teaches slavery. Muhammad taught slavery. Muhammad owned he owned a number of slaves. He said, and he had about 50 wives, a number of slaves. That's the founder of the Islamic religion. Why are we picking on America, who got rid of slavery? Well, at any rate, going on to the article, if we're not honest, we're not going to deal with the vestiges of all that harm, and we're not going to correct course. We're not going to be true to our values and morals. I would suggest that she doesn't know anything about values and morals because she doesn't know the values and morals, for example, of human life, life in the womb. She denies science on that one. She denies science regarding men and women, what makes a male and what makes a female. She denies science. So she doesn't need to lecture anybody about what values and morals are. Similarly, when it comes to indigenous Americans, indigenous people, she said there's a lot of work that we still have to do. You know, several years ago, I read an interesting book, and it was regarded the life of the Indians today on reservations. They've had the most federal aid, taxpayer money aid on the Indian reservations than any segment of society, and every metric shows that has had a destructive, horrifying effect upon the Indian peoples. Alcoholism, unwanted pregnancy, suicide, you name it, drug use, all of it is absolutely out of control, even more so than we see in the inner city. That's what happens when you pour money into it, but that's what she's indicating. We need to give more money. There's a lot of work we have to do. In other words, we want to give more money. In October 2021, Harris and President Biden's administration, according to the New York Post, was the first to proclaim Indigenous Peoples Holiday, which the vice president marked with a speech at the National Congress of American Indians Conference. Every October, the United States has recognized the voyage of the European explorers who first landed on the shores of the Americas. But that is not the whole story. That has never been the whole story. Those explorers ushered in a wave of devastation for tribal nations, she said, perpetrating violence, stealing, and spreading disease. We must not shy away from the shameful past. We must shed light on it and do everything we can to address the impact of the past on Native communities today. End of quote. Ladies and gentlemen, was there no violence between the tribes in America? You know, we talk about the Native Americans as if they're all one peoples, in the sense that they're all peaceful, and we have the idea of them smoking peace pipes and everybody getting along happily. And her statement says that's exactly what happened until the Europeans came here. Then we introduced war. You know what? That is so stupidly ignorant. That was already going on. Tribal warfare continually across. You look at a map of the Americas or United States before the Europeans came, and you tell me what the tribal territory was for different tribes: the Blackfoot, the Sioux, the Shoshone, the Crow, the Apache, the Yavapai. You tell me what their tribal territories. Well, it depends upon what year you look at the map, doesn't it? Because they pushed each other around, they murdered each other, they were continually at war with one another. That was the way that they lived. Europeans didn't introduce war. We didn't introduce violence. We didn't introduce stealing land. To steal land, you have to have ownership. But the Indians supposedly didn't believe in ownership of land. How do we steal land if they didn't believe in ownership of land? That was a European misunderstanding about the Indian culture, but they didn't believe in ownership of land. That's why they could never have any farming. That's why very little farming. Some of them did, pueblos and so forth, but very little had farming. They didn't have ownership of land. They didn't have deeds to property. They didn't have such a thing. So this is all just bunk. It's all political nonsense that is trying to rewrite history. So the Trump campaign in a press release then claimed the vice president has exclusively celebrated Indigenous Peoples Day over Columbus Day each year she has been in the office. Kamala Harris is your stereotypical leftist. This is Trump campaign writing. Not only does she want to raise taxes, defund the police, she also wants to cancel American traditions like Columbus Day. President Trump will make sure Columbus Days, or rather Christopher Columbus's great legacy, is honored and protect this holiday from radical leftists who will erase our nation's history like Kamala Harris. Not all Democrats have denounced Columbus Day, by the way, which was first designated a national holiday in 1934 to mark explorer Christopher Columbus's arrival in the Americas in 1492. But let me say this, added one more note. Do you know what the greatness of America has been? The greatness of America is that we have the freest peoples, the freest, that is the form of government, enabled the greatest freedoms in America that the world has ever seen. And do you know, by 1900, America was feeding one half of the world. One half of the food supply came from America. That's because we unleashed, with Christian principles, the freedom and the productivity of people. That's what happened in America. So when you think about Columbus Day, remember that, but that's what Americans have been able to do. That's what the Europeans were able to bring to the table on this one. We'll be back in just a moment. Columbus Day, what Kamala Harris had to say about it, what the left generally likes to say, and what they like to, they attack America, everything America they like to attack, with so much misinformation, so much malinformation. It's just absolutely pathetic. But a couple of years ago, just in the same vein here, there was a Thanksgiving protest at Plymouth Rock, and they charged America with genocide against the Native Americans. It was reported by Fox News this time that activists were gathering at Plymouth Rock at Thanksgiving, so Thanksgiving is coming up, and they were gathering at Thanksgiving time to protest the racism and oppression faced by indigenous peoples throughout history. The annual meeting to remind America of, quote, the genocide of millions of native people, the theft of native lands, and the erasure of the native cultures, end of quote. Now, the host of this event was the United American Indians of New England, UAINE. So protests included demonstrations against Plymouth Rock, Mayflower, the governor of then Plymouth Colony, William Bradford, just demonstrations against the places, against the people of history. The UAINE, United American Indians of New England, says on its website that it has volunteers to speak to classes in schools, universities about current issues in the Native struggle, and is backing a Massachusetts legislation that creates new public school curriculum standards, which includes teaching that European peoples have practiced genocide against Native Americans. Part of the Hate America program designed to erase our cherished ideals of freedom is the continual program that portrays early American white settlers, United States government itself, as having committed a planned genocide against the noble American Indian. Some movements demand that Americans pay reparations to the noble red man for these historic crimes. And so reparations, that's the way that the Democratic Party buys votes from the Native Americans. They want to buy, now Kamala Harris is talking about reparations to black men because of slavery and giving them also money to help them start a business, $20,000. What is it? We're buying votes. This is so unconstitutional. It's so out of bounds for what is right and wrong. But it's very pathetic. It's very, very pathetic. So regarding reparations to the red man, for example, the DePaul Law Review, 2002, appeared this piece, The Need for Accountability and Reparation, 1830 to 1976, the United States government role in the promotion, implementation, execution of the crime of genocide against Native Americans. So the author is Lindsay Glauner. He argues that in the colonization of America, our ancestors engaged in one of the most heinous acts of criminality against mankind, genocide. And this international crime, Glauner insists, now demands reparation. So in a day in which socialists wish to eliminate misinformation by government censorship, it's remarkable that this entire agenda moves forward unabated. No one seems to be calling their hand on it. What is lacking here is common sense, historical perspective, and a reading of real American history. So let's just start with S.L.A. Marshall. S.L.A. Marshall was a great general in the Army. He was a historian. He wrote a number of books, and one of them was called Crimson Prairie. It was a 1972 book. I remember reading it in the 1970s. I've gone back to it and looked at it several times. So he reminds us in this book that this new teaching standard, these new standards that they have, which hangs genocide on the European culture, is all simply vogue. It's just popular, that's all. It is the Bash America curriculum fashionable at all levels of education today. Marshall states, quote, "Not all Indians were virtuous and trustworthy, and not all white men were greedy and unscrupulous." Now surely people can understand commonsensically that that is the case. It is true that the United States government and individuals many times grievously wronged the tribes of Indians on this continent, but a balanced view of history is not just so one-sided. The wars of the West were simply unavoidable, not because of a greedy white man, but because of a complete clash of cultures. And far from falling into a category of systematic extermination or even a planned genocide, our government had a multifaceted and changing approach to the West, seeking to adapt itself to an increasing volatile situation. Let's talk about genocide for just a moment. The term genocide was coined in 1944 by Polish-Jewish lawyer Raphael Lemkin, who documented Nazi government policies of systematically destroying national and ethnic groups, including the mass murder of European Jews. The term genocide combines the Greek term geno, which means tribe or race, with the Latin suffix "cide," meaning that is C-I-D-E, to kill. So genocide. Lemkin defined the term as a coordinated, now listen to this, a coordinated plan of different actions aiming at the destruction of essential foundations of the life of national groups, with the aim of annihilating the groups themselves. End of quote. Now, looking at the definition of genocide, I wonder how anybody can read history. And I've read plenty of Old West history, plenty of that material. I just spent my youth in all my early years reading all that material that I could get my hands on. I don't see how anybody can read that material and think that there was some planned governmental genocidal plan to annihilate the Indians. That is simply not what happened. That's not how it happened. That's not how it unfolded. Nothing like that occurred. I'm not saying that the government never reneged on any of their promises, but at the same time, I'm going to point out that many Indians also reneged on their portions of the promise also. That's just the way it was, and it was because we have a clash of culture. The official United States policy toward the Indian was never a planned, systematic extermination. That never was the plan for the United States government. There may have been individuals who wanted that. I'm not trying to defend every individual that ever wrote or every armored general that ever said anything about it, but I am saying there was never a government plan to exterminate at a systematic level the Indian nations. If we just think for a moment on the reflection on the root causes of the Indian Wars of the West, shows that the causes were multiple and really unavoidable. Now here's S.L.A. Marshall again. The wars were not the poison fruit of bureaucratic negligence, nor were they strictly the evil consequence of white exploiters cheating the Plains Indians of his lawful property. They didn't even believe in property rights. I'm adding that one, but here's Marshall again. Though all too frequently they were given to that appearance with government giving its backing to the exploiters. Rather, violence beset the western frontier and lasted because the fundamental interests of the two sides were so wholly irreconcilable as to leave little or no room for compromise. That is exactly the truth. And that's how Marshall puts it. So consider the following points. Number one, before coming of the white man to the Great Plains or to America, life was not an idyllic existence and the spirit of live and let live. That just did not exist, in spite of what popular opinion may be. Pawnees killed hundreds of Navajos. Comanches made war on the Apaches. The Sioux hated the Pawnee and the Crow, and they all warred against each other. They even pushed each other around. And so, as I mentioned in the first block, if you look at a map and say, okay, where were the Indian tribes? Where were they located in America? Well, it depends upon what year you're looking at, because they all pushed each other around. They didn't have property rights, so-called. They simply dominated property by the force of the tribe, and that's all there is to it. So Marshall says this: intertribal warfare developed out of the desire to dominate the richest game land, enlarge the pony herds, and loot weapons. That's what they were all about, looting weapons. Anybody who reads, for example, the Lewis and Clark expedition, Stephen Ambrose writes a great book about it, cutting across the western United States, Missouri River, then crossing the Rocky Mountains, going to the Pacific Ocean. You'll notice immediately their first contact with the Indians that were there, specifically the Sioux. They thought they were completely they were people who were dishonest. They didn't hold up any of the end of the bargain. All they were doing was floating through on the rafts. But that's just the way it was. So intertribal warfare, that just occurred continually. The Indian tribes continued aggressively to push one another all over the map, and the ancestral lands belonging to particular tribes and villages continually changing. As I've said more than once, get a map, look at it. Look at the different maps, the different years. To believe that European settlers, therefore, introduced wars to the Great Plains and were the great perpetrators of violence is really to ignore history. But that's what the Democrats do. They just hide, dodge, lie, and then they hope that you don't do any reading in history. Marshall again says, greedy whites may be guilty of many crimes against the Indians, and so may the U.S. Army, but neither one nor the other may be rightly accused of making war like the Sioux Confederation. They were warlike from the time they were born. And the Sioux Confederation was always warlike. That's why they dominated the Northwest Plain territory. Regarding any large tract of America, it might be asked, just think about the tracts of land in the West. To which Native American tribe did some of those tracts belong? It depends upon, once again, the time frame that you have in mind. The Native Americans were never united. They warred upon each other. They stole one another's lands. Isn't that interesting? But yet, the picture that is given to us by Kamala Harris, who apparently never even took a history course in it, or if she did, it was one of the politically correct Marxist rewriting of history. She doesn't understand that at all, and neither does the left. Added to that is the structure of Indian society. I want you to think about this for a moment. The structure of Indian society is frequently misunderstood by the white man, even misunderstood by our government in the past. The structure of Indian society did not lend itself to making treaties. The United States government was not able to control the flowing population of settlers moving west. That was not a planned genocidal movement west. And neither was a chief in an Indian tribe able to bind braves to a council decision that the chiefs had agreed upon. Now, it works with the Indians. Why does it work with Americans? That's exactly what happened. The United States government could not control the white settlers that moved west. Nor did the chiefs of the Indian tribes control the braves that wanted to make war upon the whites or other Indian tribes. They couldn't control them. So the treaty-making ability was simply not there. As a matter of fact, Indian males achieved status and political importance from their deeds in war or from their feats as plunderers, either actual or what they may make others believe they had done. For extra claiming and great boasting, that was expected of them. And these deeds were accomplished on an individual basis. One of the outstanding features of the Oglala Sioux, for example, Crazy Horse Warrior, was the fact that he did not participate in self-congratulation of deeds accomplished. Read his biography by Mary Sandoz. He simply did not participate in self-congratulation. That was so unusual for the Sioux Nation because they all exploited, plundered, robbed, stole, lied, killed, and then they would brag about it. But he did not do any of that. So peculiar was this to Indian society that all of his biographers note that fact about Crazy Horse. Now here's something else. How about the U.S. official policy, the government policy? The official U.S. government policy continued to change as time moved forward. In the 1820s, for example, a line of 10 small forts was built, running from Minnesota in the north to Louisiana in the south. And these were lightly manned, insignificantly garrisoned. They were intended to serve as a Western world's kind of Great Wall of China. Their placement established what was officially termed the permanent Indian frontier. So it ran from Minnesota down to Louisiana. That it was possible, or I should say, it was impossible to maintain this boundary of westward expansion can easily be seen. They had simply a number of forts. Encroachment began in earnest in the 1840s by Americans moving west, but it was hardly a planned program of Indian extermination which inaugurated it. The country was open country, tribal territory only by force of numbers. There's nothing evil about settlers roaming the West as the Indians had roamed in other tribal territories for decades and centuries. There's nothing evil about that. And I absolutely resent the fact that we have politicians that all they want to do is hold America somehow guilty of genocide. This brings us to a third consideration, which is the fact that the inevitable traffic flow that moved toward the Pacific coast is what caused friction, not government policy. Differences between white and red men were moving to a dead end. The clash of cultural concepts in this movement is absolutely inevitable. It was no more possible for Indians to keep their hands off a carelessly guarded horse corral or a vulnerable herd of cattle than it was for the white man to abandon the rule that private property was sacred. This is just the way people understood. This is the way that people lived. So European settlers, white settlers, they had ideas of property rights. But the Indians had completely different idea. They had, here's a horse corral that is unguarded. We can steal from it. And they didn't think anything about it. Same thing with herd of cattle. The Indian knew no law against raiding. Horse stealing or the running off of someone else's beeves was to his mind an achievement, a stroke to his credit, a coup. The two scales of values were as unlike as crimson and cream and totally irreconcilable. That's how Marshall puts it regarding the white settlers and the Indians that were here. Government bureaucracy may have been blind to these realities, but they were hardly the conniving villains they've been out to be. So in this clash of value systems, the white settlers naturally called upon the United States government for protection. That's how it happened. They moved west. The Indians stole their cattle, came and took their beeves, took their horses, and so they called upon the government to protect them. The United States Army pushed deeper and deeper into Indian territory, feeling that they need to protect the European settlers. And on the subject of the flow of traffic across the Great Plains, the Indian culture might be called what Marshall refers to as rootlessness. He says it was the freedom of movement, the privilege of ranging far and wide seasonally that gave his life meaning and dignity. That is, the Indian moved wide territory, wide swaths of territory seasonally. And once that freedom became threatened, his culture, his creature habits, his customs, his manner of providing for his family, all of these things were imperiled because his freedom of movement to wander where he wanted to wander was actually curtailed. The white man's way of limiting him to a piece of ground upon which to settle was to suggest to him the loss of everything that made his spirit proud. I sympathize with that. But that is not to say, therefore, there's genocide that has been practiced. The migratory manner of living being curtailed, it was only a matter of time that this pressure point would explode into open warfare. And that is exactly how it happened. In conclusion, General Marshall offers this. So we are speaking of wars that virtually had to be. Though the notion that there is always a viable and less violent alternative is today no less popular than is the theme that the Plains Indians were without sin and were made victims of predatory whites. End of quote. That, of course, is how it is portrayed today. And so while I myself lament the Indian Wars of the West, it is well to remember that American Western history is not so lopsided as to render the government or the American people as culpable of genocide, even less to consider the Indian Wars on the whole as monstrous crimes against humanity. That's simply not real history. So Kamala Harris is absolutely wrong on this, but she sounds the notes that have been spoken in the Marxist universities and by the Marxist professors that we have. Everything is about bashing America. Real history needs to be looked at.